I grew up in Amish and Mennonite circles, so very conservative Anabaptists, and Anabaptists have a really unique view on education. Most of them value manual labor from a younger age. I always had this dream that I wanted to go to college. God opened some doors, and when I was 18, I had the chance to go back to school and get my GED. I was hired into an accounting firm as an entry-level bookkeeper. Had zero accounting experience beforehand, so my first boss took a huge chance on me. He made it possible for me to go to college because he let me work part-time in his office, and then the other time I would study.
Welcome to the Be Unbound podcast. I'm your co-host, Jonathan Brush.
And I'm your co-host, David Rethemeyer.
And we get to do an extraordinary and ordinary interview today, and we get to do it with one of our own. It is our delight to introduce you to Tim Fisher. Tim is an Unbound alum. He is an Unbound colleague, and he's an Unbound friend. And I would be hard-pressed to figure out which of those is sort of ranking higher. Well, actually, I'm not hard-pressed. He is above all a friend, a very dear friend, and one that we're just blessed to be able to count as a colleague. Partly because Tim, as you're going to find out in this interview, has a lot of strengths and a lot of talent. And so it's always fun to have that kind of strength and talent in your payroll. But as you also hear in this interview, Tim's a lot of fun to hang out with. And we enjoyed hanging out with him on this podcast and having this conversation. And through it, you will hear some of the stories that we've been able to experience and do together. And Tim, for his age, has led quite the remarkable life. So, David, anything else that folks should know before we jump into the conversation?
Yeah, I will just add that I think if you look up Tim on the team page on our website, you will see that he is our controller and he works in finance, and he very much is conscious of the fact that people who work in financing companies have a reputation for being boring. I do not believe I have ever met somebody who works in finance who is further from boring than Tim. Tim is very excellent at what he does in finance, but he has, as you said, a wealth of experiences, and also having been on multiple multi-hour road trips with Tim, he is also just genuinely one of the most interesting and most fun people to hang out and have conversations of all varieties with. So I think this conversation that you all are about to listen to is an excellent example of that.
There's a lot of variety here. So next will be Tim in our conversation, and we're looking forward to introducing him to you. Well, it's my pleasure to introduce Tim Fisher. Welcome him to the Be Unbound podcast. So first, I'll just give you a little bit of background about how I know Tim. It was 2020. Things were going a little crazy. And for the first time ever, we had one of our premier student events was Capstone. This was prior to our assuming ownership of Unbound. And at that Capstone, it was determined that we couldn't go to all the places we normally would go. It had to be online. And so we did our first online event, which honestly is a real come down from the live events that we normally do. And so it's hard to sort of figure out how to connect to people. And on that event, there were a couple of people that really kind of rose above and sort of stood out as people that were working really hard to engage and get the most out of this capstone experience and to talk to other people. And one of those was Tim. And so I definitely got a glimpse of who Tim was and was impressed with what I saw as I saw his participation as a student. And so then later, as we went forward, we assumed ownership of Unbound, and we had some live events, and they were shorter in duration because we were still dealing with some COVID restriction stuff. And Tim showed up for one of those, and everything that we thought nicely of him about when it came to the online stuff was true in person as well. And so after that, Tim joined the National Student Cabinet and planned our first event, which was our first full-scale event after COVID. So there's a bit of a challenge to that. And we just continued to have so much fun with him that we went ahead and hired him and paid him to stick around. And so Tim is now our controller, but that's not all he does for Unbound. He's also a speaker. He's very much somebody who is a key person in developing content and sort of the ideas behind Unbound. And he wears a lot of hats, honestly, on our team and contributes certainly on the financial side, but maybe in some ways even more so on the program side in terms of helping us think through the different ideas that we're doing, speaking and articulating those ideas. And he's got a pretty interesting backstory himself. If Tim wasn't so nice, you'd really hate him because I don't know that I've run across anything that we have tried that Tim hasn't excelled at. And honestly, those kinds of people can drive you crazy unless they're as nice as Tim is. And so fortunately, Tim does fall in that category. And so therefore, it's a pleasure to know him and an honor to know him. And so, Tim, welcome to the Be Unbound podcast.
Well, thank you. That's a terrific introduction, and I really appreciate it. It's fantastic to be back.
So, Tim, just as we set this up and we get to get into this conversation, tell us a little bit about your story. How did you wind up at a virtual capstone event for Unbound?
Man, that's quite the backstory too. Every time I think about it, it seems my life is a series of events. I like to compare it to a puzzle that there's maybe the frame was put into place and then there were pieces put together, but for the most part, I had no idea what the image was. There were just pieces that kept falling into place and it seemed pretty random over time. But looking back on it now, I can tell that of course it wasn't random. It was providential. And the series of conversations and the people that I met that led me to where I am today has been just a favorite part of my life story that I get to share at any time. A bit of backstory. I was born into a conservative Anabaptist family. So my family was actually Amish when I was born in Michigan. And I grew up in Amish and Mennonite circles, so very conservative Anabaptists. And for those of you who don't know, Anabaptists have a really unique view on education. Most of them value a lot of more of the manual labor from a younger age, and a lot of them don't go to high school or college. And that was my family. Nobody in my family had gone beyond eighth grade. And so it was very typical in our communities, since they were mostly self-sustained communities, for people to go through eighth grade of education. And then you just graduated and got a job. That's what all my friends did. That's what I did. And my parents and my one sister had gotten their high school equivalency diplomas. Very few people besides them in my community had done that, but my family still valued education. And so I also graduated age 14. I have my diploma that says I graduated from the eighth grade from this Christian school in the middle of nowhere in Illinois. And then I went to work and worked in construction for a few years. But I always had this dream that I wanted to go to college. And so I just didn't quite know how I was going to make that happen because, again, it just hadn't really been done. But God opened some doors. And when I was 18, I had the chance to go back to school and get my GED. And then by just a series of, again, really cool events, I was hired into an accounting firm as an entry-level bookkeeper. Had zero accounting experience beforehand. I just basically knew that negatives in front of numbers were probably bad. And if we were looking at graphs, the trend should be going upward to the right. But besides that, I didn't really know a whole lot. So my first boss took a huge chance on me because I wanted to get out of the construction industry and go more into the financial world. And so he made it possible for me to go to college because he let me work part-time in his office, just doing the book work that I was doing. And then the other time I would study since it was a nice and quiet place. So that was my entrance into college and also my entrance to Unbound because I was looking for an online college program that would let me get my degree debt-free and on a faster schedule, which ultimately didn't end up happening because I worked the whole time. But it let me still get my college degree debt-free and then connected me to just a really incredible community of people that today have become some of my best friends and I get to work with. So that's the educational side of it, of how I got to where I am today and how I got plugged into the Unbound community. But in a much bigger way, the kind of the trajectory of my life changed around that time too, because I was also looking for a lot of answers to some of my life's deep questions, answers about meaning, answers about, purpose in life, and how do you really get the most out of life? And so as I came into my college journey, expecting to learn a lot about accounting and finance, I was plugged into some worldview training, some leadership training, and that fed a hunger in my soul that just really changed me forever. And so it helped me wrestle with some of those big life questions about meaning and purpose and destiny. And then also really gave me the tools for leadership development to start becoming more of a leader, both in my community, in my own life, and then in the other spheres. And so really culminated in more of an attitude toward life of extreme ownership and just being willing to try a whole bunch of different things. And so it ended up with me traveling all over the place, jumping at every chance to travel that I could get, a couple international trips all over the country, and just saying yes to every adventure became one of my mottos. And that has broadened my horizons in just so many ways. As a Midwestern kid, I didn't live in just a whole bunch of different places. I was born in Michigan, And I've lived in Illinois and Indiana and Ohio. And so I just really spent a lot of time in the Midwest. And then most recently, just moved clear across the country to California to be closer to my girlfriend. And that was just one of those big events that was built on a series of smaller events of saying yes to a lot of adventure. And so that continues to be my life mantra, really both in work and then also my personal life. If there's an adventure to be had, I can make it work. My answer is yes. And that's really how I got to where I am today.
That's an interesting bookend. We had an interview with Andrew Pudewa, our conversation with Andrew Pudewa recently. He was talking about his primary advice is to have young people say yes to as many experiences as possible. And honestly, Tim, I'm not sure that I know anybody who has had the breadth of saying yes to experiences that you have. But it's not just saying yes to those experiences. You have a unique ability, and we're not trying to butter you up here, but you have a unique ability to have some outsized performance in some of those places. And so just to kind of give a little bit of a taste here, I know Tim as an endurance athlete who is a serious runner who's done a pretty significant, with one of our other colleagues here at Unbound, has done a pretty significant gravel bike race and did really well at that. I know Tim is somebody who we joke around a lot. It's like, oh, did you know Tim can speak another language? Oh, yeah, Tim can speak another language. Do you know Tim can ice skate? Tim can ice skate. Did you know Tim that can do this, can do? And so there's a lot of different things that come up. And so that's not just trying to be complimentary here. It's that there's an attitude there of saying yes, but there's also an ability to build skill there. And so I'm wondering if you could just, sort of pull the curtain back a little bit. And so it's yes to say, it's saying yes to a lot of experiences, but there's also a component of expertise and excellence that's built in there. And so was that something that, you absorbed from your upbringing? Was that something that you made a conscious decision on? Where was that kind of connection between, oh yeah, I'm going to say yes to do these things, but also I'm going to lean into them in a sort of way that allows me to build some serious skill?
That's a terrific question. And actually, the interesting thing is I can go back to the very time in life when this whole attitude started, because it really was an attitude and it was a whole life's change for me. So I was 16 years old, working in construction, and for the first time was really coming up against some big life purpose questions. And I looked at where I was at in life and the trajectory that I was on. It was a trajectory that everybody around me, all my friends my same age, had been on. And so there was a pretty clear-cut path for career. I could work my way up in the company that I was in, make my $50,000 a year for the rest of my life, die in a very small community with very short horizons. And I could do that with a degree of happiness, with a family and all that. But there's just something about that didn't appeal to me. I knew there was a lot more. And so I started just living with this hunger in my soul, knowing that there was more, knowing that the world had more to offer, knowing that I had more potential, just not knowing what to do with it. And so thanks to a few mentors, and then honestly, mostly I started listening to guys like Zig Ziglar and Dave Ramsey. And all at once, these guys, some of the early motivational speakers, especially like Zig Ziglar, when they started talking about how hope is the foundation for a successful change, and how that you can have anything in life you want if you'll just help enough other people get what they want. All at once, that started giving me some answers. And I was thinking, well, if there's more to life and I really want to accomplish more, but I want to do it for the glory of God and for the good of people around me, how do I go about pursuing that? And so I remember working in construction, doing a job that wasn't fulfilling. I knew I wasn't going to do it forever, just not knowing how to get out of it. And I just started listening to these guys. And over time, it built whole new soundtracks in my head of saying, well, the way to get out is, first of all, to develop some degree of excellence in where I'm at. So in this construction industry, doing my best because I want to leave on a very good note, and I want to serve both my boss and my teammates and then customers well. And then especially just take that attitude and apply it to every part of life. And so the attitude of excellence and really extreme ownership was something that I started to have the discipline to develop both in work and then in running. And then it translated to other parts of life too. And it didn't come without a lot of grunt work and a lot of pain. For example, I remember some of the first times of trying to run. And I say try because I was pathetic at it. It was really kind of humorous looking back on it now. Just, being able to run for, it felt like 200 or 300 feet at a time, and then just being completely out of breath and just thinking, this is stupid. It's impossible. what in the world do I even think I'm trying to attempt here if I want to, eventually run a half marathon or a marathon? But there is something about dogged persistence, and I don't claim to have the skill to just innately pick up a new ability. I know that's not the case, but there's something about just having an unrelenting will, where if you just I discovered it was more a thing of just me saying, I'm just not going to give up. Like, I'll do this or I'll die trying. And eventually, if just living into that day after day after day and being consistent, it started to have some results. But then more than that, it was also having the will. I call it a will of steel. And that was something I repeated to myself often when I was out on those long runs. Just like, I'm not going to give up. I'm not going to give up. I have a will of steel. And then it was doing that alongside a training plan that started to give me some results. And that's really where it started to pick up for me, because I would be out on long runs. I would start to see results. I'd come back. I'd be completely spent. I'd be so tired. I'd have blisters on my feet. And I had to get up early in the morning. There was a period of time, especially during college, when I would get up at 4:30 in the morning and just go for runs just to get the runs in on time. And what I discovered after doing that for a while was it changed the way I looked at life, because I had more energy to go into my day. It gave me a sense of accomplishment every time I hit another really hard running goal. And then I was starting to think, well, what if I did this in other parts of life too? It transferred. So it didn't just stay in one area of life. And then simultaneously, I was blessed to work alongside some really cool people who also started to point out potential in each other and including in me. And so being in a work environment, a student leadership group, for the first time, of people who could see the good in each other and who were really calling out that good, also continued to open my eyes to, but what if I'm actually good at what they say I'm good at? And how can I live into that more? And so it was, at the same time, developing those skills of doing endurance running transferred into work and my social life. And then also being surrounded by a network of people who really started to believe in me and called out the good. And then I started to believe that for myself and started to call that out in other people. And over time, those just became default. And that became my whole way of life. So it's today when I go on a run, or there's hardly ever a time when I'm out and I don't remember the pain of those early days of just building that foundation, because that's what it was. And it was the same way with work. I mean, there were 4 or 5 years there where I just did again, working for an accounting firm, just doing the 9 to 5, the grind. And it taught me a lot of skills that I still use today. But man, I never want to go back to that schedule, because it was soul crushing.
Well, I think it's interesting, though. I mean, when you say you don't want to go back to that schedule, but you also set that up when I ask you kind of the source of that. You pointed to that schedule as kind of the genesis moment, that you had a moment where you were inspired to do something different. And so I think there's an interesting breakdown here. You had a moment where you say, "Hey, I want more than this." And then if I'm listening to you correctly, there was a time where you wanted more, but you didn't know how to get more. And I don't think you had doors open to you from the way you told the story. In other words, I want more, but I don't really know what to do. And so instead of this wasn't a matter of you found some great connections or you did something radical. I think what's interesting to me is that you did something really, really simple, which is you went running. And so you're talking about getting up at 4:30 in the morning, and you're talking about knocking down these barriers. And I think, I'm not sure if you said this directly, but I know you said this before. You're running and listening to this material, so you're learning these things, and then you're also doing the grind 9 to 5. You're doing those kinds of things. But now here's the part that I just want to make sure I caught correctly. I think you said 4 to 5 years. Is that correct? Was that the time frame you gave?
Yeah. Yep.
So 4 to 5 years. And then towards the end of those 4 to 5 years, things really picked up steam. And so if I've got this correct, it's been in the last 3 or 4 years that, we started this conversation by saying you said yes to a lot of experiences. I think if I've got this correct, most of those experiences have manifested themselves in the last 3 or 4 years. Do I have the timeline correct, Tim?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, the way I look at it is that it was really about the same time that I started running. distance running and riding, and the time that I took the job with the accounting firm and the time I started college. So really, 3 or 4 big life events that I started, or long-term goals I started at the same time. And the first 3 years were just often kind of just pure misery because there was a steep learning curve in everything. And so there were plenty of days when I'd kind of wonder about the whole purpose of it, but I knew I had a goal to aim for. Like when I started college, that was my goal. I knew I had at least 4 years to go. And then it wasn't until after the 3-year mark when I was facing a lot of frustration again with work because of the learning curve, with running and all of that. And then after 3 years, I started to see a lot of those payoffs. So it's a little bit like investing, right? Like you invest, $1,000 in the stock market, and you won't see the returns on that, the first month, the first 2 months, or probably not the first year. But then you just give that time, and over a couple of years, you start seeing the dividends. Those first 3 years were just paying a lot in and not seeing the dividends. And then the next 2 to 3 years after that, I started seeing a lot more. And I say that fully realizing I'm still young. I feel like a kid at heart. And so I look back on those experiences and I think, well, if that was possible, like in the last, 7 years, what's possible over a lifetime? That gets me pretty excited.
Well, and something that Jonathan pointed out here is that the changes and the adjustments that you made there, those are things that are significant life events, but really they are not necessarily like massive changes when it comes to just like dramatic things that a lot of people will talk about. Like these are life changing events. These are things that I think a lot of people would say are ordinary life events. But what it sounds like made a huge difference for you is the mindset that you looked at those things through, to have sort of, as he put it, the iron will, and then to be able to say like, yeah, this is unpleasant right now, but I know this is where God has me. And so I'm going to keep going regardless of how much it's unpleasant right now. And so I think that's something that we don't really talk a lot about in our modern culture, is the fact that some of the biggest changes that we can make in our lives are made by sitting in really uncomfortable, unpleasant circumstances, sometimes for a really long time, to see through ultimately where God has us. And so the fact that you're able to now look back and see that is really cool.
Yeah. This just reminds me 2 examples just for clarity for the audience, because I'm kind of a wuss when it comes to pain. I also have a bent towards kind of laziness. And so when I started running,
That was
this
evident from your
wasn't,
story, Tim. Yeah, we definitely. David, did you get that too? Mentions
Yes.
running with blisters, and he's kind of lazy. Yeah, I totally got that from what you said so far. Carry on, Tim. Go ahead. Yeah.
well, I've kind of beat it into submission over the years. That was kind of that iron will where it came in handy. But to get started, this wasn't like putting on running shoes and going out and running in the dark on backcountry roads, because I lived in the middle of nowhere in Ohio at the time. I had to lower the barrier to entry as low as it would go. And so this meant when I started running, I went on, I forget if it was Craigslist or Facebook Marketplace. It was one of the two. Found a treadmill that a guy in Cincinnati was selling for $750. Went half and half with it on my mom. She paid half, I paid half. Went out, picked it up, and put it in our air conditioned basement right outside my bedroom door. I mean, I could get up, I could put on my running shoes, step out of my bedroom door and be on the treadmill in an air conditioned basement. That was what I had to do to get started running. And then I just had to force myself to get up and do it every single day. So like when you say it's small steps, David, that's absolutely right. Like it meant spending the money, putting the treadmill right there where it was, and then just, you know, torturing myself through it. And I really beat that thing up over the next couple of years, put so many miles on it. And eventually I think I moved out. And the last I heard, I think my dad took it to the landfill because it just completely trashed it. But it was really small steps. The second one was diet. Like I look back on that now and I realize diet was such a big thing that I changed about the same time I went into the accounting world, because I went from a very active job, construction, to a job where I sat behind a desk for hours at a day. And so I would go to these business conferences and I'd see all these other guys in their 40s and 50s who were really out of shape. And, because they'd apparently not monitored their diets or not had lifestyles that were active. And I just looked at that and I thought, well, if this is the trajectory my life is on, what changes can I make today to make sure I don't get there? And so it just meant doing some diet changes. And then, those built up over time. So it was not, you're right in saying that it was not a few massive changes that just overnight or over a week or over a month. No, this was changes every single day. Like setting up a schedule to where running became the default every day, or setting up the way I shopped for food and what I bought and how I made food, just making that the default, that I wasn't going to do it. Like it started with the 30-day no sugar challenge where I completely cut sugar out. Felt great after that. And then I just kept going. So it's 100% the daily step.
Well, I think there's two things. The first was this idea that, I just want to make sure that that didn't get sort of slip past, that it was 4 or 5 years of hard, 4 or 5 years of a tough schedule, 4 or 5 years of getting up early, 4 or 5 years of doing things in a difficult way that then led to a bunch of breakthroughs. And I think that people tend to pay attention to the breakthroughs and they tend to miss the stuff that comes before. But there was a second part that I think was pretty interesting, in that the things that you were doing outside of running all were connected to relationships that you had. So you talked about really good colleagues and a really good boss that gave you the opportunity in accounting to put the grind in. And then you took a risk and certainly showed you initiative in terms of picking a program that you didn't have any frame of reference for. So you joined Unbound when nobody around you had done that. I think you had a friend that knew about it, but it wasn't like your family had done that before. And then, from my outside perspective, a whole lot of the adventures you talked about afterwards have come through a lot of those contexts. And you mentioned that as well. And so I don't know if you speak to that a little bit, because it seemed like there was this interesting 1-2 combination of absolutely putting in the grind and the work and the endurance and the preparation and the groundwork, that's for sure. But also there was a real connection there with relationships that put you in positions to be able to do those kinds of things. So I don't know if you want to speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, that's a great point, because I look back on my life, and especially over that time, and what I see is a convergence of people and situations and a hunger for growth. And God really connected all of those in some pretty remarkable ways. In fact, the way I got into Unbound, it all traces itself back to a single conversation I had at a business convention. So I just started the accounting job, and my boss took me to a national convention with a bunch of other business leaders. And I knew that I'd wanted to become an accountant, probably a CPA at the time, but I just wasn't quite sure how to do it. And I met another CPA there who'd done online college program, precursor to Unbound. And through one conversation with him, he pointed me in the right direction. So I went back home. My other friend, Brian, in Ohio, had prior experience with college. And so he helped me with the admissions process. So without him, I probably would have never made the admissions call, but he sat right next to me and walked me through it. And then, of course, my boss, who actually made the whole process of being able to do college while working at the same time, made that possible. And so it's really interesting thinking of the people who have come alongside to make that happen. It reminds me of what one of my mentors once told me. He said, "Tim, there are always going to be people who will walk with you for a season of life. So they'll come alongside you, they'll be there for a bit, and then at some point they'll probably move on and you'll part ways." And that's the way life works for a lot of people. And so it made me look back on those times. I still keep in touch with some of those people, but just definitely not as much as I did then. But first of all, it makes me very, very grateful for the people and the ways that they've made things possible. And secondly, it's convinced me that there's no such thing as a random meeting of somebody. And so now today that's influenced my prayers to become much more, God, who do you want me to meet today? Whose path am I going to cross? And who knows what implications that has? And this isn't, I don't say that just because it's like some kind of this is all about my success. And if I just meet the right people, I'll become more successful. But it's thinking that this could be the same thing for somebody else. Like, what if I get to come alongside somebody and introduce them to an opportunity that will make their lives better, or that will set their lives on a trajectory for their growth that'll change their family or their personal lives? So it was really cool just tracing back and remembering that, those conversations seem pretty random, but they're anything but random, because look at where they're at today. And then that's continued today with a bunch of my relationships. For example, it's how I met my girlfriend. was because through mutual friends and through a community connection that came out of Unbound and came out of the college program. And it's just broadened my world in every single way. And I would also say it's also given me a whole new set of social tools that have been translated to other parts of life. So going from an introverted kid who had a very small world and was really terrified to meet new people to somebody who's still a part-time introvert, still getting better at that, but who now has a set of tools to overcome the fear of meeting new people and who has, definitely chosen to opt into community, not just because, again, for personal success, but just because that's what it takes to be a healthy person.
Yeah, David and I know Tim as an introvert, just like we know him as somebody who avoids pain and is lazy. So
You guys just don't see that part that much anymore.
well, it's doing a pretty good job covering it up, I gotta say. So, my final thought here, Tim, is that so you mentioned Zig Ziglar and Dave Ramsey and a lot of other things, and we've read a lot of the same books. And there is a tendency to read those books, and there's a definitely an inspiration to that and a drive. There's also a side effect that people talk about less, and that is it takes a lot of energy to be a self-made person. It takes a lot of energy to be a self-made success. And that energy is devoted pretty much to the things that are your goals. And so I've observed people, and it's like, they're very successful, they're very goal driven, but they're also very narrowly focused, and there's a very myopic and there's often a self-centeredness to that. And I don't mean that universally. I just mean that there's a tendency to drift that direction. But yet in your very language that you've been talking about with us here, you've mentioned multiple times other people and the relationships that are not for your gain, but for an ability to serve. You've referenced your faith several times. That's an interesting line to walk between reaching your full potential, using the gifts that God has given you, and yet not losing sight of the fact that you're doing that as an act of service to those around you. And I'm not claiming that you're doing that perfectly, and I say that because I know you wouldn't either. But I do think that, even in your way you've told your story here, you've referenced that several times. So talk a little bit about how you've managed to walk a little bit of a tightrope there where, you are a driven person. You are a person who is striving after and achieving a measure of success. And yet I know you personally as a friend, as somebody who is very others focused. You are the farthest thing from a self-centered person that I know. And in that sense, you break that kind of mold and that paradigm. So talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I know this started way back when I was listening again to Zig Ziglar, when I was swinging a hammer, running a stapler, working with wood and all that fun stuff. And at first, when I got into it, it sounded really strange. And for those of you who know Zig Ziglar, he has I forget exactly what it's called, but he had the card. It's kind of like a self-affirmation card where you're supposed to take it and it has qualities that you're aspiring for. And you take it, you put it next to the bathroom mirror, and every day you look at yourself in the eyes and you read this. And I remember the first time I saw it, I was like, oh, this is weird. This is so weird. Like looking at myself and talking to myself, this is like trying to manifest, it's so wacky. And so I didn't do it for a long time because of that. I thought this is super self-centered. Like I have an ego, but my ego's not that big. And so I didn't do that, but I kept listening to him. And then over time, I started to see a trend, and that you can look at what these older motivational speakers like Earl Nightingale and Zig Ziglar and Les Brown, some other guys, you could take what they were saying and you could completely turn it self-centered and, really have that self-made mentality. But if you really dig into what they're saying at the core, they're always promoting a life of service. So for example, when Zig Ziglar would say, you can have anything in life you want, but it comes when you help enough other people get what they want. And then if you listen to all of his talks, the things he always prized the most highly were his relationships with his wife, with his family, with his community, the opportunities, like his health, all of that. So he really had a clear value of what was most important. And so I started seeing that, then it made more sense. And so I tried the whole self-affirmation thing, saw some really good results from that, just in confidence and in the way that I started to see myself. Because for the first time, but over time, I realized that there was a good in me I hadn't seen before. And these guys pulled it out. And so when I could look at myself in the mirror and I could say, hey, Tim's actually a pretty cool guy. like that feels so weird to do that the first couple of times you do it. But I was like, I like him, and he has a lot of good to offer the world. And so it was learning how to have a much kinder voice to myself. And again, it wasn't in some kind of like, I'm just going to build myself up for my own success. It's actually true, because what happened is I started serving others more out of that service, out of that attitude. And then along with that, one of my mentors at the time, still a good friend, I was asking him about some life advice because he was very successful, and mostly the success that I saw him in, that I knew him for, was in his family, because he had fantastic family relationships with his kids, with his wife, and he had a couple of kids who were married. So like, he'd seen the whole spectrum. And I asked him some of the things that meant the most to him in life and how he oriented his life. And the thing that always stuck out to me was, he said, it's all about a life of service. Like, if you make your life a life of service to the people around you, you'll end up with everything you want and then some, and you'll know true fulfillment. And I looked at him and I thought, you know what? That's worth it, because I can see what he's done, and I can see it hasn't been without a ton of work and blood and sweat and tears. But man, look at what he's got. He's really happy. He's not the wealthiest man I know, but he's pretty well to do. And most of all, he has great relationships. And so that's what really, that became the thought that rang through my head a lot then, just day in and day out, was that, how can I serve the people around me? And then ultimately what happens is, I end up with a life of fulfillment, but more importantly than that, I have great relationships, and I leave the world hopefully in a better state than I found it. Actually, maybe that's not the best way of saying it. What I ended up saying then is that I put more into the world than I take out. And that's only by the grace of God and actually having people around me to invest in.
Well, Tim, I think those are powerful lessons, that the idea that, if you're going to start by putting in the time and working hard, but that, where you're going to get to is almost always through the relationships that you have. And if the relationships that you have are not going to get you to where you want to go, then it's time to seek out some new relationships. And that in doing so, if you're doing that with an attitude and an idea of service and helping others, that's ultimately going to provide a guardrail to make sure that you're doing it for the right reasons. Thanks for coming on to the podcast and sharing some of your story. If any of you get a chance to meet Tim, you might participate in a game that David and I and my family like to play in, which is, we try to imagine something that Tim hasn't done. And we're to the point now that, if Tim was like, actually, once I was fighting off great white sharks while I was diving on the Great Barrier Reef looking for Amelia Earhart, I'd be like, well, that makes sense. I totally get that. I'm not surprised at all. And so that kind of commitment to grinding it out and to serving other people can lead you to some really interesting places. And Tim has way more stories than you would expect for somebody his age. In fact, we also do this game where it's like, if we add up all the careers that Tim says he's had, actually Tim isn't really 20 something. I think he's like 58, maybe 60, just in terms of time. And so you packed a lot of living into those years. Thanks so much for coming on to the Be Unbound podcast. And yeah, it's an honor and pleasure to call you a friend. And it's a real kick to call you a colleague. So.
Hey, same. The pleasure's mine. It is truly an honor to work alongside you guys and to hang out. And really, you guys have been the inspiration for a lot of the adventures, a lot of saying yes. So we'll keep the party going.
Well, here's to many more adventures to come. Well, I hope that lived up to its billing in terms of interesting. I have heard Tim's story multiple times, but David, I don't know about you, but every time Tim tells a story, it's not that he changes details. There's details that he hadn't had before. And so they just kind of rise to the surface. And I'm like, oh, and he talked about, a puzzle piece that went together. Well, I'm telling you, having known Tim for now, I don't know, 4 or 5 years, every time I talk to him, I'm like, oh, click, there's another puzzle piece. Oh, click. Oh, yeah, that will explain why it is this. Oh, click. And still, we didn't talk about half the stuff that I know Tim is being good at. And so it's just fun. Like I said, if he wasn't such a genuinely nice guy, I would probably.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. It's always really interesting because he is very much somebody who acknowledges that, like, yeah, I'm excited that I am able to be good at this particular thing, or that I have had these experiences, but there was a lot of things that were not necessarily the most positive that led up to that. And so he's always really enjoyable to listen to from that aspect, because you never feel like you're hearing that from somebody who is touting their experiences. It's just somebody who genuinely loves getting to have a variety of experiences and just enjoys getting to share them with others when he can.
There is definitely a thread that runs through people like that. And in all seriousness, one of the things that we didn't talk about in the conversation, but we should probably loop back around to and mention here. I know other people like Tim. In fact, we've had someone on the podcast, Nathan Rittenhouse, really falls into this category of somebody who is extraordinarily talented at a wide variety of things. And yet, when you're in their presence, that's not the focus. And so they're also extraordinarily talented at making people feel welcome and being people that you really genuinely love and like and want to be around. And so if you're listening to this and you're inspired by what Tim has accomplished, and I think you ought to be, I am when I talk to him, I'm around him, don't miss the part that makes it the best, which is the humility. Tim is genuinely trying to make himself better, but you saw like woven into, and I observed this in the conversation, woven into that, there wasn't a to be better for being better's sake. There was a to be better to serve others' sake. And that part is the absolute essential piece here. That humility, that others focus, that commitment to helping others, and that understanding of his place in terms of who he is and who he is in relation to God, it is what makes all those skills so interesting instead of so annoying. And so we joke about it a little bit, but yet that's a really important thing to keep in mind. And that's to be able to seek excellence with humility, I think is the closest thing that I know to a surefire formula to be one of the most interesting people around. And I think in that sense, it was a fun conversation to see that. So anything else, David, before we talk a little bit about Unbound and wrap up here today?
Oh, I just think that, yeah, kind of transitioning into that, Tim is a fantastic example of somebody who leans into the benefits of what we offer here at Unbound. And I think in a lot of ways just exemplifies what we strive to equip our students with. And that is just a willingness to lean into what God has for them and to go out and have those experiences, and to do that in the context of relationships. And that's really the goal of what we attempt to do at Unbound, is to train young adults to thrive. And so, yeah, I think that he's an excellent example of looking to do that.
Well, and what I just observed is kind of our really deep desire for the students who come into the program. We want you to be excellent, but we want you to be excellent in the service to Christ and his kingdom. And those things go hand in hand. And so we talk about being extraordinary to ordinary. It is the foundation of a lot of what we teach in all of our programs. And the idea of being extraordinary to ordinary is very much reflected in what Tim related as his life story, right? He was in a very ordinary circumstance in a small community, in a small town in the middle of the Midwest, where the horizons weren't necessarily very big. And he looked at that and wanted bigger horizons, but he didn't then rebel against everything that was around him. He didn't say, I'm too big for this community, I want nothing to do with it. Instead, he leaned in to being extraordinary at the things that are in front of him. He started running and he started working. And you heard him say that he committed to be excellent at his construction job before he left that. And then he spent years being excellent as a bookkeeper and excellent in serving his boss and serving his colleagues and teammates and all those things. And then that excellence continued to open doors. And he did take risks. He joined a program that nobody else in his family had done before. But then we know Tim as somebody who came in and was excellent at the things that we asked him to do. He was excellent at Capstone. We did it virtually. He was excellent when he showed up and worked at the cabinet and put in his heart and soul into making our 20 Apex really fantastic. And so all of a sudden, Tim lives out the second part of that saying, which is like, tell students, be extraordinary. And when you do that, you will find that the extraordinary becomes ordinary. And in many ways, people look at Tim's life and say, oh, that's extraordinary. And they miss how he got there. And that's not something that's limited to sort of super special people. That's available to everybody. And that's really the heart of what Unbound does. And yeah, we do it through high school programs, Equip and Explore and Declare. We do it through our classes we teach, like Navigate. And we do it primarily through Ascend, which is our flagship program. And if you're listening to this when it airs or close to it airs, this is the time to be thinking about Ascend. And I don't know how to more strongly say that we have the privilege of working with a lot of people like Tim. And we have the privilege of taking things that we've learned from work with a lot of people like Tim and systematizing it and teaching it to other people. And it's, yes, just being clear and transparent here. We run a business and it's great to have people come into the business and all those kinds of things. But we also feel that we are stewarding a movement and that there is a need for people who are extraordinary and ordinary, who are committed to excellence, but who continue to work in their local communities, who see bigger opportunities, who are willing to serve other people, who are willing to get good at what they do so they can serve other people better. And, I think that we can say with a great deal of confidence that we're pretty good at building people like that and training people like that and teaching people to thrive in that context. And we offer this extraordinary community they can be a part of as well. And so you heard Tim saying that everything sort of took off once he got into the community and these connections. And that was the Unbound community. And so if that's interesting to you, if this is inspiring to you, if you're motivated by it, I would suggest that you're in the right place and that you can do that. And probably the best way you can do that is to check out Ascend and check out and give us a call and talk to us and see how we might be able to serve. And if you do that, you'd make David and I's day as well. So with that, we will look forward to the next time that we are together. And until then, be unbound.